Elizabeth of York never publicly spoke about her brothers, Edward V and Richard of Shrewsbury, but she clearly never forgot them. Her actions and subtle signals indicate that she deeply loved the princes in the Tower and believed they were dead. I'm not just referring to her willingness to marry Henry VII and be crowned queen, both acts that publicly acknowledged the Tudor monarch as the legitimate ruler. These decisions were likely more about political necessity than personal desire for the York princess. But I will discuss this at the end more in depth. What's truly revealing is how Elizabeth acted as queen during a time when discussing her brothers was evidently discouraged. In the records linked directly to her, there is only one piece of evidence that mentions one of the princes, found in her private expense accounts from the last year of her life. A closer examination of these entries provides deeper insights into Elizabeth as a person. However, before delving into these details, let's revisit the year 1483. I have two letters, not from Elizabeth herself, that I've been eager to share. In my research, I often uncover more material than I need, sometimes finding duplicate information for a specific topic. These letters add context to the story and shed light on Elizabeth's complex world. The letters in question are part of the Stoner Compendium, written by Simon Stallworth, a subdeacon of Lincoln, and addressed to William Stoner. The first letter, dated June 9th, 1483, was penned while Elizabeth of York and her family were taking refuge in Westminster Abbey. Her youngest brother, Richard, was still with her, while her brother, Edward V, was already in the Tower of London. I have modernized and condensed the letter to focus on the most relevant details. Master Stoner, after a few recommendations, I send you my regards. As for news, since I last wrote to you, there is nothing new to report. The Queen remains at Westminster, along with my Lord of York, my Lord of Salisbury, and others who have not yet departed. Wherever any goods belonging to my Lord Marquis are found, they are being seized. The Prior of Westminster was, and still is, in great trouble over certain goods delivered to him by my Lord Marquis. My Lord Protector, my Lord of Buckingham, and all the other lords, both temporal and spiritual, were at Westminster in the council chamber from 10 to 2, but none spoke with the Queen. There is great activity in preparation for the coronation, which is set for 2 weeks from today, as we say. I hope you will be in London by then, and you shall know all that is happening. The King is at the Tower. My Lady of Gloucester arrived in London last Thursday. May Jesus preserve you. Written in haste from London by the hand of your servant, the 9th day of June, Simon Stallworth. The second letter, dated June 21st, was written just 12 days later and reflects the dramatic developments during that time. Again, I have modernized and slightly shortened the text. Honorable Sir, I send you my regards. Regarding news, you are fortunate to be away from the chaos here, for there is much trouble and everyone is suspicious of each other. Last Friday, the Lord Chamberlain was beheaded shortly after noon. On Monday, there was a large assembly of armed men at Westminster. The Duke of York was handed over to my Lord Cardinal, my Lord Chancellor, and many other temporal lords. My Lord of Buckingham met him in the middle of Westminster Hall, and my Lord Protector received him at the Star Chamber door with many kind words. He was then taken to the Tower with my Lord Cardinal, where he is, thank God, in good spirits. Lord Lisle has come to my Lord Protector and is now attending him. It is believed that there will be 20,000 men from my Lord Protector and my Lord of Buckingham in London this week. I do not know their purpose, but it seems to be to maintain peace. My lord is very busy and more burdened than he would like, though he would prefer it otherwise if possible. The Lord Archbishop of York and the Bishop of Ely are still in the Tower with the King. Men have been placed in their positions to ensure their security. I believe that men from my Lord Protector will be sent to these lords' estates in the countryside. They are not likely to be released from custody yet. Please forgive me for writing no more, as I am so unwell that I can barely hold my pen. May Jesus preserve you. Written from London on the 21st of June by the hand of your servant, Simon Stallworth. All of the Lord Chamberlain's men have now become my Lord of Buckingham's men. To the Honourable Sir William Stoner, Knight. Regarding the credibility of these letters, some details, such as the supposed 20,000 men of Richard and Henry Stafford intended to maintain peace in London, may be exaggerated. Considering London's population was around 50,000 in 1500, accommodating and feeding such a large force would have been a significant challenge. Additionally, the exact date of William Hastings' beheading, referred to as the Lord Chamberlain, is debated. However, the letters still provide valuable insight into the immense pressure Elizabeth's family must have faced. The chaotic, confusing, and threatening circumstances for the royal family are vividly depicted. Interestingly, Lord Lisle, mentioned in the letters, refers to Arthur Plantagenet, the illegitimate son of Edward IV, who will reappear later in this video. I present these letters not just because they are historically fascinating, but because they also address the question of whether Elizabeth of York might have considered leaving Church Asylum without her family. At that time, it seems highly unlikely that she would have felt comfortable doing so. Elizabeth Woodville, as is well known, eventually reached an agreement with Richard III in the spring of 1484. In March, her family emerged from Church Asylum and Elizabeth returned to court. There, she allegedly caused her first scandal by dressing identically to Queen Anne Neville at Christmas. She was otherwise housed with Lord Stanley, as Edward IV is said to have requested on his deathbed. Shortly after this scandalous Christmas, one of the few letters believed to have been written by Elizabeth was supposedly penned. Sir George Buck, who authored a historical work in the 17th century, claims to have seen this letter. In it, Elizabeth wrote to the Duke of Norfolk, asking him to intercede with the king on her behalf. This letter, along with the Christmas incident, fueled rumors that Richard might have been considering marrying Elizabeth. What is more intriguing is to whom she addressed this letter. The Duke of Norfolk, John Howard, who had taken the title from her youngest brother Richard in 1483. By appealing to someone who had benefited from the downfall of her brother, Elizabeth either acknowledged that Howard now held the title because her brother would never return, or she was utterly desperate. In the letter, Elizabeth is also said to have written that her entire life was in the king's hands. This suggests she had accepted her fate, that Richard III had won and that her family's only hope lay with him. However, to confirm this with certainty, the original letter would be needed. Nevertheless, it seems she was prepared to adapt to this new reality. Yet this new reality would be upended just 6 months later. On August 22, 1485, Richard III and John Howard both died at the Battle of Bosworth. A source, though not credible, recounts Elizabeth's reaction and mentions her brothers, the most pleasant song of Lady Bessie. While the entire poem is lengthy, the critical lines, which I have modernized, are as follows. They struck his helmet until it crushed into his head, until the brain came out with blood. They didn't stop until he was dead. Then they carried him to Leicester and dragged his head beneath his feet. Bessie met him with a cheerful smile and greeted him with these words, "How do you feel about the killing of my dear brothers?" This passage describes Richard's death, with Elizabeth, referred to as Bessie, apparently viewing it as just retribution for her brother's murder. The source is attributed to Humphrey Brereton, who claimed to have been Lord Stanley's esquire and allegedly delivered many sensitive letters, including those between Elizabeth and Henry Tudor in Brittany. However, two versions of this text exist, which are not consistent. Additionally, Elizabeth was in Sheriff Hutton Castle in Yorkshire at the time, far from Bosworth, which is 160 kilometres away as the crow flies. These lines are likely a later invention, knowing Elizabeth became queen and that Richard was blamed for the prince's deaths. This doesn't rule out the possibility that she genuinely felt this way, but the song is not evidence. Fast forward. Elizabeth's coronation on December 25, 1487, marked not only her acceptance of Henry VII as the legitimate king, but also a public indication that she did not believe her brother Edward was still alive. Giovanni de Gigli, who later became Bishop of Worcester, reported that Henry also made her Duchess of York. She later passed this title to the future Henry VIII. What is significant here is that her brother Richard had last held this title. By accepting it, Elizabeth publicly demonstrated her acknowledgement of his death and her position as the heiress of the House of York. This had already been confirmed by the Pope, who declared her the undoubted heir of Edward IV on March 2, 1486. In sum, Elizabeth did not need to make a literal statement about her brothers. Her actions clearly indicated that she believed they were dead. This is evident in other aspects of Elizabeth's life as well. She considered herself the head of the House of York and acted accordingly. For instance, Edmund de la Pole's wife was spared after his fall, thanks to her intervention. She was allowed to live with John Howard. Elizabeth also played a key role in arranging the marriages of all her sisters. Moreover, she brought Arthur Plantagenet back to court, where he served as a cupbearer. When her sister Catherine found herself alone around 1500, after her husband William Courtenay was imprisoned as a supporter of de la Pole and his possessions were confiscated by Henry, Elizabeth took in Catherine and her children, providing them with £50 a year, while William was in custody in Calais. Elizabeth's younger sister Bridget became a nun and maintained regular correspondence with the Queen, who supported her financially. These actions demonstrate that Elizabeth had not forgotten her two brothers. This devotion is further highlighted in a eulogy written by the poet Bernard André during the reign of Henry VII. André wrote, "She exhibited from earliest childhood towards God an admirable fear and service. Towards her parents a truly wonderful obedience. Towards her brothers and sisters an almost incredible love." André, who received payments directly from the court and served as Prince Arthur's tutor, as well as participating in the education of Henry VIII, knew the Queen personally. Although this single sentence is brief, it suggests that Elizabeth did speak privately about her brothers. However, there is one notable exception to her care. Elizabeth did not extend direct help to her cousin Edward Plantagenet. The Earl of Warwick remained imprisoned in the Tower until his execution in 1499, with Henry covering the cost of his provisions. As hinted at, the only direct mention of the princes in Elizabeth's records appears in her accounting book from December 1502. The entry, when modernized, notes that the Queen gave 3 yards of fabric to a woman that was a nurse to the prince, brother of the Queen. This shows that Elizabeth had not forgotten the former servants of the princes in the Tower and continued to care for them, as demonstrated by this gift. Unfortunately, we don't know the identity of the nurse or which of the 2 princes she served. However, the term prince indicates that the reference is likely to one of the princes in the Tower rather than Arthur Plantagenet. It's also possible the nurse cared for her youngest brother George, who died only 2 years old. This nurse isn't the only example of a servant of the princes who remained connected to Elizabeth. John Argentine, who was among the last to have access to Edward V, was his physician. Domenico Mancini recorded a poignant description of Argentine's role. The physician Argentine, the last of his attendants whose services the king enjoyed, reported that the young king, like a victim prepared for sacrifice, sought remission of his sins by daily confession and penance, because he believed that death was facing him. Argentine later became the physician to Elizabeth's eldest son, Prince Arthur. Given his previous service to the York children, it seems likely that Elizabeth chose him for this role. It's difficult to imagine that she wouldn't have spoken to him about her brothers. Argentine later became the provost of King's College, Cambridge, where he served until he died in 1507, and he is buried there. Elizabeth surrounded herself with people who had known her brothers, keeping their memory alive through those connections. For the sake of completeness, it's worth mentioning that if Perkin Warbeck had indeed been her younger brother Richard, though this is unlikely, the same would apply to him. His wife, Catherine Gordon, became one of Elizabeth's favourite ladies-in-waiting, and Elizabeth even provided her with financial support, as noted in a record of 11 shillings. I also reviewed the entries from the day of Warbeck's execution, hoping for a clue, but found no irregularities for that day. However, I'm open to new interpretations if evidence suggests otherwise. But I found 2 entries in Elizabeth's account book that, while officially dedicated to other purposes, may hint at her remembrance of the king. The first entry, dated November 1st, 1502, records a payment for the children in the King's Chapel. Elizabeth usually made such payments during Christmas. Corresponding entries for similar payments appear in Henry's accounting book. The second entry, dated November 5th, notes a donation in memory of St. Edward and his relics at Westminster. Typically, donations for St. Edward were made on the anniversary of his death in January. In 1503, a donation was recorded on the correct date in January. While it was not unusual for the royal couple to make unscheduled donations for St. Edward, the timing of this donation is noteworthy. Edward V was born between November 2nd and 1470 in the sanctuary of Westminster. Elizabeth was thus very close to her brother's birthplace around his birthday, and she donated both to children and in memory of the saint with the same name. Additionally, in 1503, Henry made a donation to St. Edward in the first week of May, exactly 20 years after Edward V was meant to be crowned. Elizabeth also donated in December to Henry Langton, identified in the account book as an old servant of her father, Edward IV. Henry had also made a payment to an unnamed servant of Edward V in July of that year. Langton may have been related to Edward's chaplain Thomas Langton, who died in 1501. In this context, the support provided in 1502 makes sense. Overall, it is striking that both Henry and Elizabeth were intensely engaged with their past during this period. One reason for the heightened focus on the past could be linked to James Tyrell. In the spring of 1502, Tyrell was brought to London on charges of high treason, imprisoned in the Tower, and allegedly confessed to the murder of the princes in the Tower, claiming he had carried out the act on behalf of Richard III. He was tried for another betrayal on May 2nd, 1502, and executed on May 6th. Tyrell's confession is documented solely by Thomas More. However, it is undisputed that Tyrell and his son Thomas were indeed in the Tower. For instance, Sir John Shah offered 300 marks for the life and liberty of the younger Tyrell. Shah also had an indirect connection to Elizabeth and the princes in the Tower, as he was the nephew of Ralph Shah, who had first preached against the legitimacy of Elizabeth Woodville's marriage to Edward IV. Furthermore, entries in the account books confirm that Tyrell was held in the Tower during the spring, including expenses for his accommodation. It remains unclear whether the royal couple met Tyrell during this period. Nevertheless, Tyrell was in the Tower concurrently with Elizabeth. Based on payments for rowers, it is likely that Elizabeth was in the Tower from April 27th to May 2nd, 1502, with Henry possibly staying a few days longer, a topic we will explore in detail at another time. Regardless of the credibility of Tyrell's confession or its existence, he was undoubtedly a significant figure for the Queen due to his involvement in the events of 1483. As a person accused of treason, he would have had a vested interest in avoiding the typical punishment, which he did, as he was merely beheaded. Given the timing and circumstances, it seems plausible that the royal couple was involved in Tyrell's interrogations. Henry, known for intervening directly in interrogations, had previously done so in 1495 and again in 1502. It is also important to note that Arthur had died at the beginning of April, a loss that deeply affected both Elizabeth and Henry. While there is no clear reason why they would have been at the Tower, recent scholarship by Tim Thornton in a 2024 essay has effectively countered the long-standing belief that it was merely a favoured residence of Henry VII. Although it cannot be definitively proven that Elizabeth and Henry were at the Tower because of Tyrell or that they spoke with him, this scenario remains entirely plausible. Let's switch gears for a second and talk about Elizabeth's kids. At first glance, her children appear to have been deliberately named in a way that avoids any direct reference to the princes or the York line. Arthur, for example, shared his name with the illegitimate son of Edward IV, though this association would have been innocuous. Henry VIII was named after his father and carried the name of all Lancaster kings. The third son, Edmund, who died at just 1 year old, was named after Henry VII's father. The reason for this discussion is the uncertainty surrounding whether Elizabeth of York may have had a fourth son who died young. There are occasional mentions of an Edward Tudor. I will provide an example from a website where this name appears, though unfortunately there is no source attribution. The same lack of origin applies to other mentions of this name. The most plausible explanation for these mentions is that Edward might be a misinterpretation or miscopying of Edmund. If a son named Edward had existed, it would have been significant due to its direct reference to Elizabeth's brother. I bring up the topic of Elizabeth's children because she was deeply concerned about their safety. For instance, she and her mother-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, ensured that her daughter Margaret was not sent to Scotland prematurely, according to the Spanish ambassador Don Pedro. Henry lived with Elizabeth until he was old enough to be the heir to the throne, and she was actively involved in his education. While Elizabeth's motto was humble and reverent, she was far from passive when it came to her children's well-being. Thomas More's early poem, A Rueful Lamentation, reflects the Queen's perspective as she bids farewell to her family. The poem describes her experiencing more woe than wealth, which likely alludes both to the early deaths of her children, particularly Arthur and the princes in the Tower. Notably, in More's poem, Elizabeth says goodbye only to her surviving sisters, Cecily, Anne, Catherine, and Bridget, while her deceased children are not mentioned. This omission may be More's way of avoiding the delicate issue of the prince's absence, or it could be an intentional highlighting of their absence. The fact that they were mentioned elsewhere, as indicated by André's counterexample, suggests that their omission in More's poem is significant and deliberate. However, there is no question that in death, Elizabeth once again remembered her brothers. She passed away in the Tower of London on her 37th birthday, February 11th, 1503, succumbing to complications from the birth of her last daughter, Catherine, who also did not survive. Historical debate exists regarding whether the Tower was intended as the place of her confinement for childbirth, or if she was brought there prematurely due to complications. The rooms Elizabeth occupied had only been completed 6 weeks before her arrival. They are situated between the Bloody Tower and the White Tower, areas associated with the princes during their time in the Tower in 1483. I have indicated these locations on the map. Following her death, Elizabeth remained in the Tower for 10 days, with her body laid out in St. John's Chapel for mourning ceremonies. Her surviving sisters gathered around her during this time. If the bones discovered under the stairs of the White Tower are indeed those of her brothers, the siblings were reunited in death within the Tower. Today, they all rest in Westminster Abbey, reflecting their enduring connection. To conclude, without a doubt, the fate of the princes in the Tower was pivotal for Elizabeth of York. She was present in the sanctuary when her brother Edward was born and witnessed her younger brother's transfer to Richard. Had her circumstances been different, she might never have become Henry Tudor's wife or queen, nor would she have assumed the leading role in the York family. Although both Richard and Henry apparently sought to avoid public discussion of the princes, Elizabeth never forgot them. She recalled her brothers vividly, especially in the later years of her life. Evidence of her ongoing remembrance is found in her actions, such as her association with Argentine, a figure connected to her brothers. No surviving record suggests that Elizabeth ever doubted the death of her siblings. Many may argue otherwise, but there is no direct statement from Elizabeth confirming her brothers' deaths. Nevertheless, her actions convey a clear message. By marrying Henry Tudor, the Lancastrian heir, and possibly accepting the title of Duchess of York, she tacitly acknowledged that these titles were now vacant. Claims that she had no choice but to marry Henry overlook the fact that both she and Henry were not initially eager to wed. In December 1485, Parliament had to insist that Henry fulfill his promise to marry her. This raises the question of whether Elizabeth had any freedom to resist the marriage. What is evident is that she accepted her new roles and titles, which had once belonged to her brothers. This acceptance does not speak to the guilt of Richard III or other suspects, but indicates that Elizabeth, as far as we can discern, believed her brothers were dead and sought to honor their memory discreetly. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this content to help the channel. Bye.